I promise you I didn't write that, and I'm not quite sure who did. But anyway, look, I would have been quite happy to listen for another while to David Hickey. The only time I was never happy with David Hickey was when he was a Dublin footballer and Dublin were playing Meath as a proud Meath woman. He was a little bit on the awkward side, and he got in the way, even more so than our lot were capable of getting in the way.
In case there was some Meath people with you, I have two of my colleagues.
Our reputation goes before us. I was also very interested, I have to say, and I'm just going to say it in his analysis of Cuba. Myself and John, my husband, went to Cuba supposedly on our honeymoon, aided and abetted by a motley crew of people from Dublin, Frank MacDonald and Garrett Sheehy and a couple of people from the Dubliners and a number of others. Now this was, and Joe Kelly, who had pulled all this together. This was not a sort of an individual honeymoon. It was collective in the social sense, but not in any other sense. But I have to say, I was extremely impressed. At the beginning, we left on New Year's Eve at the end of 1987. I was extremely impressed, as we all were, by Cuba. In those days, you left from Shannon on an Aeroflot flight and ended up in Havana. It was an extremely interesting place to be. And a lot of what David has been saying was certainly very obvious to that motley crew of people from different sort of semi-lefty, I have to admit, backgrounds in Ireland. And there were some Geldofs involved as well. From that sort of a background in Ireland, even then, you know, the health service, the education. And what really I remember very clearly is the commitment of the ordinary people that you met in the streets, the commitment of ordinary people to the republic that they were struggling to create. You know, that was really phenomenal and very, very interesting. And I hope that I'm going to have the opportunity to go there again sometime soon. Now, what I have the job of talking about today, though, is nothing as interesting. It's an attempt to reimagine the Republic by looking at international scrutiny and promoting human rights, justice and equality and sustainable development. And what I'd like to do, with your permission, and at the very outset, to commend the organisers of this summer school, you know, to commend all of you who have been involved with it, for going the road less travelled on what is normally called human rights discourse, and for being, I think, quite unique in what is frequently referred to as the human rights community. So I'd like to give all of you involved in organising this unique summer school a round of applause. And for the rest of the short time I have, I'd like to just try to do a little bit of scrutiny on what passes for scrutiny in the international human rights framework, if you'd like to put it that way. And to start with, I'd like to provide two starting points. First of all, if we think of our own starting point here, and there's been a lot of talk about the 1916 proclamation, but I think it does provide us even still with a very good starting point. We mightn't have used human rights language in those days, but the idea of cherishing all the children equally, and the idea of creating a space that's just, I think, is one that lives very clearly with us today. And secondly, I'd like to contextualise my remarks in Ireland's international and regional commitments. Now, we're committed to a number of UN conventions and to supporting a number of UN rapporteurs. Now, rapporteurs can come to visit on the invitation of a country. The last rapporteur who came to visit, no, there has been one, but it wasn't quite as difficult a one, was a woman who was a very good friend of mine called Magdalena Sepulveda, who was at that time, she didn't get appointed again, who at that time was the international rapporteur on extreme poverty. And she provided, I think, what was a very, very useful report. And so I think there is some value in these things, and it's worth noting. But for rapporteurs to have a go at things, they have to be asked by the country. So therefore we need to put pressure on the state to actually invite the rapporteurs that we think are important for the issues that we're dealing with. The second thing we're party to are a number of conventions, and there are 10 basic conventions, human rights conventions of the United Nations that we're party to. Now, since progressive realisation is facilitated in actually fulfilling one's obligations under the conventions, this is a concept that can be just widely abused. And again, in a way, blaming and naming and shaming is sort of one way of doing it, but progressive realisation is important. There's no point in pretending everything can be done at the same time, but it is also important to realise that it can be abused and frequently is. With the Council of Europe, we're party to a number of conventions, and we're also party to a number of instruments like the Commissioner on Human Rights of the Council of Europe. And again, I think we can underestimate the importance of that sort of scrutiny. When previous commissioners for human rights were here, and I don't think the current commissioner, the Latvian current commissioner for human rights, whose name of course escapes me, what's his first name?
Musnik.
Yeah, Niels Musnik. I think it's quite important because the previous rapporteurs who came here, or the previous commissioners who came here from the Council of Europe, were able to make useful reports which did have an impact. In particular, for example, I recall both on traveller issues and on some other accommodation issues. For the OSCE, there's a number of instruments. They all go by consensus. But actually, what the OSCE does annually is produce a report on hate crime, which I think is very, very useful because it provides us with the sort of comparison that we might like to see with regard to hate crime and what happens with regard to it and how it's reported in Ireland. We don't have in place the overall mechanisms that we need in order to ensure that it's adequately recorded. And this brings me to a sort of a sensitive point which did come up also in this morning's discussions. One of the things that every human rights body I've ever been associated with calls for is disaggregated data. Now, we normally call for disaggregated data on the basis of self-identity, but there could be times when, for example, I'd be very clear with you, the best progress for travellers would never be made in this country if it wasn't very blatantly pointed out to the authorities through clear evidence provided by the data that travellers were being marginalised, were not getting through first level, were not getting through second level, and weren't appearing hardly at all in third level education, for example. So the issue with regard to disaggregated data can frequently be about self-identity. Do you have the right to identify yourself? Do you have a choice in that? But I would not underestimate the importance of it. It's really important, and it's a really important tool. There are ways where it might be used in an offensive fashion, but overall it can be a really important tool for securing rights. And lastly, and one doesn't always mention the European Union when one talks about human rights because, and one is correct not to do so because it certainly didn't have a human rights basis. The basis of the European Union was mobility of those things called goods, capital, and then those other things called lumps of labour. But increasingly, labour people have succeeded in getting some rights in the European Union, and given that, the vindication of those rights in the European Union can sometimes be taken to the Court of Justice in Luxembourg, which I'd have to tell you has a far greater capacity to deliver things than any of the other courts, because if they don't do what they're told to do by Luxembourg, it comes out of the next tranche of structural funds, so therefore there is a capacity to actually deliver on the sort of dictates of the Luxembourg court. So what am I saying then with regard to our institutional starting points? I'm saying our institutional starting points exist, but they don't automatically deliver. And there's a gap, not just a gap between implementation, but a gap between implementation, outcome and impact. Even where on paper there's implementation of the rights that are recorded in these instruments, it doesn't always mean that the next stage happens either. The other sets of starting points I'd like to refer to then are ourselves, and are about the way in which human rights coming from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are and should be understood. First of all, that they're indivisible. Secondly, that there's an interdependence between them. And thirdly, that there's an intersectionality between them. And I think what we need to get beyond in a hurry is any notion that that means you just add in, for example, women and stir. You know, it's just not about that. It's about understanding that if you're talking about racial discrimination against women, it has a gendered dimension that creates not just an additional, but a very different sort of experience, and that requires very different sorts of responses. And it also requires very explicitly that the rights of those who are being subjected to those experiences are understood, are articulated, and that they have the right to participate in doing something about them. And I think it was really interesting to hear Sylvia and her other friends who have or are still in Mosney this morning speaking to us in that regard, and speaking to us also about the complexities of the gender dimension and how that gender dimension is experienced in that process of being marginalised and actually discriminated against. a starting point for me also is that human rights are, as I said, linked back to the UDHR and are linked also, and each of the conventions demands this, demands that those directly involved and directly experiencing the things should have the right to participate, should have the right to participate in the reports that the country produce, doesn't always happen, should have the rights to hear about the outcomes of the deliberations, and doesn't always happen. Also rooted in principles of equality and justice, but in particular, I think, rooted in roles for duty bearers and rights holders. And for me, this is the key reason why, in that move from rights into rights discourse, why that sort of language that we're now using much more extensively is so resisted by the state and is so resisted by officials. Because if you're concerned with policy implementation, and if you're concerned with sort of constrained economic circumstances, then your policy implementation is obviously dependent on your constrained economic circumstances. But if you are a duty bearer responsible for ensuring that others can enjoy their rights, then, you know, constrained economic circumstances are not really an excuse anymore. They are the context, they are the background, they may have something to say about progressive realisation, but they are no longer an excuse. And if you notice, the extent to which local and national officials are prepared to use that term about themselves, are prepared to use rights discourse, is very limited. I believe it's for a very good reason, because it does shift the balance of power, and it does also shift what is required of any of us. But in talking about rights bearers and or rights holders and duty bearers, I think all of us, especially all of us in this room who are in some positions of power, need also to remind ourselves of our roles as duty bearers. I mean, where do we come into this equation? Those of us who have been able to realise some of our rights. What's our role as duty bearers in promoting and supporting others who are trying to realise theirs? Lastly then, I'd like to say, because this causes quite a lot of rows, there's individual enjoyment of rights, but it is also about a collective expression. For example, for travellers, and I know Martin will have talked about this morning, it's about that collective expression of traveller identity, of travellers' rights to be identified individually and for the community to be identified as a minority ethnic group, for example. And that is a right that has been supported by each of the national or international UN and regional conventions that Ireland has reported to. There's reams of paper where this right has been consistently supported. And lastly, I would say then, there's also the European equality context. I think there's been this really ridiculous binary sort of process around rights and equality that has evolved in Europe. And there's also been this associated hierarchy of advocates with your academic legal lawyers at the top of the frame, and the unfortunate idiots who sort of help organise communities, and the community workers, and I name myself as one, who support community groups down at the bottom, and not even generally recorded as being part of this important gathering referred to as the human rights community. I think we need to get over that on all sides. In the European context, I make no apology for saying that the equality legislation which we forced through after 10 years of a battle, which is not anything like the sort of legislation that we wanted, but which got in the end forced through because of circumstances that were beginning to prevail in Germany and in Austria, it has delivered more for human rights than all of the international conventions. And in fact, it gets used by the international conventions as a mechanism for ensuring implementation of the international conventions. So what do I mean by that? I mean, as a member of CERD, if a European country comes before CERD, the first thing I would do as a member of CERD is look to their record in implementing the race directive from Europe. You know, look to their record, look to see whether or not they have put in place a single equality body, and look to see what else they're doing, very explicitly and in hard-nosed terms in that regard. Not because it's a nice thing they're supposed to be doing, but because it's part of European legislation and part of what they're supposed to do as a member state of the European Union. So I think there is a much more complex intermingling of that European equality context and the overall rights framework than the one that we have currently allowed ourselves to understand. And I do feel that all of us, whatever perspective we come from in it, and I speak as someone who's travelled across both sides of it, need to get over our concerns about each other and begin to create a space where we can pragmatically use whatever framework makes the biggest difference for the people who in the end own the rights, because I think human rights are owned not by any of us who are talking about them or advocating for them or working for them, but by the people whose rights should be realised and by the people whose rights are abused on a day-to-day basis in a whole variety of areas. And I think if we keep that in front of us and keep their voices in front of us, we create a different context for our work and for getting over those sorts of challenges. Now, what I'd like to do now in continuing this scrutiny, I'm much better at talking than at looking at these things. What I'd like to do now in continuing this scrutiny is to think, to just look at a couple of different things where that scrutiny, I think, could prevail. And I've tried to avoid talking about things that other people have spoken about today. I think you've heard very graphically about the issues with regard to asylum. And I felt some of the discussion was very useful in that regard this morning, particularly when we remember that if we are talking about rights, we're not talking about a number of social demands that any of us legitimately, and all of us should, in my view, be associated with creating waves for both locally, nationally and internationally. We're talking about things that have the legitimacy of international law, and as I think Joan Roddy rightly articulated this morning, that legitimacy is relatively limited with regard to asylum, but it still does very directly challenge on humanitarian basis and within that convention what has happened for the people who have been more than 2 years anyway in direct provision in this country, in any sort of provision, in fact, whatever sort of provision they're in, awaiting for an outcome, a decision with regard to their status here. Looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, they're now called the new term is Sustainable Development Goals rather than Millennium Development Goals. These things are about ending poverty, ending hunger and achieving global equality. There's 17 of them being proposed at the moment, and empowering all women and girls. Calling for urgent action on climate change and also calling for inclusive societies. They're to be adopted in September 2015, but as even Ban Ki-moon acknowledges, robust participatory monitoring and a review framework is required at national, region and global levels if they're to go any further than the Millennium Development Goals went. And as a number of you know, there's a big variation with regard to how far the Millennium Development Goals went. In fact, they went the least far. They didn't go at all for issues like, for example, the number of women who die in childbirth and around that period. In fact, that has disimproved globally in the period since the Millennium Development Goals were thought about. Part of the issue, though, with regard to these Sustainable Development Goals is that there is a human rights and equality sort of language here and there, but the systematic targeting of human rights obligations as part of these Sustainable Development Goals has not been stitched into them. Let's be really clear about it. So you put in a little bit of language, but then the systematic targeting of the systematic targeting of the systematic targeting of human rights obligations when you're implementing them. That just has been totally left out of the process. It might be useful for us to note, and of course there isn't any reference really then in these goals to business and human rights. And if we look to global development at the moment, you could sometimes replace the term global development with global race to do business. I spend a bit of time in West Africa, in Liberia and other places, and every time I get on a plane to these countries, it's full to the gills with two different types of people, one of whom are usually Dutch or German owners of mines going to sort of investigate what's going on. The others in which I have to tell you are the mammies and the daddies of the Irish and English young men, mostly, who are going to visit their wonderful offspring, who are doing this great work, have this wonderful job in a mine. And when you ask them, what about the mines, any human rights concerns with regard to that, and I have to say, especially from the Irish ones, you nearly get your head chopped off. How dare you challenge the fact that Johnny has a good job somewhere in Africa? Isn't it wonderful that he has a good job and he'll be coming back home? Raises questions for us about integration of human rights education into our training and education systems, whether it's a medical system or whether it's an engineering or right across the variety of our professions. We tend to think about it very easily when we're talking about the sort of things that I do in the social sciences and with community workers and youth workers and maybe even with teachers, but we don't think about it at all. Where human rights can really matter is, what does the bloomin' engineer do? How does he actually, in running that mine he's running, wherever he happens to be running, and it is normally a he, what does he do about the rights of the people who are actually working there or who are having a very difficult time attempting to work there? Kenya and Ireland are the co-facilitators of the process that will lead to the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. As far as I'm aware, very few of us in this room have engaged with them. We have left that sort of engagement to those in this country concerned in a more overall way with north-south issues globally. And there's not a direct engagement of those of us concerned with sustainable development issues here, with the exception perhaps of Friends of the Earth and some of the other groups that are directly focused on climate change. I believe if these are to have any value, and I do have a question as to how much value they will have, but if they're to have any value, those of us concerned with rights and development in Ireland need to grab hold of them and need to make sure that this notion of the empowerment and equality for all women and girls actually gets turned around into something that makes sense for the work that people are struggling with in order to create equality for women and for girls in Ireland. The treaty body scrutiny process you're probably all familiar with, and this is my second and last example, and then I will try to manage to shut up. What happens is that the countries report, for the developer report, now actually Susan, Ireland has only reported twice to CERD. You're dead right, they should have reported an awful lot more times, but they've only reported twice. And Ireland has a good enough record. You know, what we managed to do is to report in time, not to be in the really bad category, but we don't report sufficiently in time to actually be seen to be engaging with good practice. So, for example, Ireland is due to report in the summer has been examined in the summer on the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And that report was due in 2007 and it finally got produced in 2012. I just think that's not good enough, you know. I mean, we're still among the wealthiest countries in the world. There's nothing to stop us fulfilling our obligations with regard to reporting within the scrutiny system that we have chosen and signed up to be part of. Our the fourth and fifth reports under CERD were due in January 2014. On the law of averages, that's not really a very bad sort of delay, but at the same time, it indicates a lack of willingness to begin to engage directly with these issues and with these processes. But in producing those country reports, people involved have a right to demand participation and to be consulted. And what the Department of Foreign Affairs normally does is have some sort of a consultation. Those could be more robust, but to be honest with you, I think they'll be as robust as people here make them. And I know in the work on CERD, the traveller organisations at the time, way back in 2005, the first time Ireland reported under CERD, with support from the National Consultative Committee on Racism and Interculturalism, which the government felt wasn't any longer necessary after 2008, that it was irrelevant and all you needed were processes of integration. But that the traveller organisations made direct interventions at CERD at that time, which successfully put the issue of traveller ethnicity, it hasn't still been acknowledged, but successfully put that issue on the international agenda. And that does begin to make a difference because it gives a credibility and it gives a status to the issue that is difficult to give to adjust yourself by merely talking about it at home. The second part of that process is that the committee sets out a list of issues or a list of themes, and a lot of you here are well familiar with that. And then there's a hearing and concluding observations with implementation and follow-up. As a person who's involved from the inside, it is very practically possible to lobby and to influence how any of these committees do their work. You can take it for granted there'll be some people involved. There's 18 members on a full committee usually, and I'm one of 18 on CERD, and there are only 4 women. You can take it for granted that among those committees there'll be some people, even although we're described as independent experts and elected as independent experts, you can take it for granted that some people won't be that independent. But you can also take it for granted that there will be a number of people on those committees who will be wholly independent. I have to say, to be fair to the Irish and British governments, of the ones that I'm aware of, they're usually, there is no interference, good, bad or indifferent, and in fact don't want to know what you're doing, maybe for good reason in some of our cases. But it makes a welcome difference, and it is possible to influence them. But the big issue then is about implementation and follow-up. And part of what we have struggled to get in the reform of the treaty body system, which last year resulted in Resolution 68/268 of the General Assembly, is to get better implementation and better follow-up. And some of us would like to see country visits as part of follow-up. The only country visit that ever took part as part of CERD was to this country, because at the time the government were prepared to facilitate that, and that was in 2006. It was extremely effective in beginning to secure implementation of a number of things. Much more effective than anything on a written page could possibly be. In considering then the upcoming report to ISESCR, I'd just like to remind you that a number of the things that have been very much spoken of in the last week or two are issues that they're going to consider. For example, the right to work, the right to organise in a trade union, and I'm reminded very much of the Dunn Stores workers, for example, last week. The right to adequate social security and health provision, and the rights of travellers to have their ethnicity acknowledged. All of those are the questions that ISESCR are going to consider. And the framework for them considering it, I think, is an interesting one, because what the High Commissioner for Human Rights, or what the office said last year, was that states have adopted contractionary austerity measures to combat budget deficits, already augmented by the crisis and bailouts, which has stalled recovery rather than done anything to so the sort of measures, in fact, have had the opposite effect of what they should have had. And they have diminished, they say, the rights of individuals to exercise their rights, and that of states to fulfil their obligations to protect them. So, in effect, what the system overall is saying is that the so-called austerity measures that have been implemented here and that are now been imposed on the unfortunate people who are part of Greece, that these, and a number of other places, that these measures have had the direct opposite result, and have also had the result of stopping states from doing what they should be doing. I say these to you by way of acknowledging that there are things that can be achieved through this framework, but if we look at the framework overall, and if we sort of acknowledge that it was also a creature of its time, it's a creature of the post-Second World War era, and that we're now faced, I think even from some of the things that David was talking about, we're now faced with changing world and power dynamics. That sort of north-south stuff, east-west stuff, is beginning to shift. And it's a very interesting shift, and David is absolutely right to record the role of Cuba in leading that shift in the Americas, in particular with regard to South America. So there are shifts, and there are shifts with regard to human rights also, and how human rights are perceived, and how human rights are being implemented or how they're being ignored. There are limitations to the framework that we have. It is quite clearly a liberal framework within an overall sort of welfarist, capitalist sort of conceptualization of the world. I'm a bit loath to throw it out in too big of a hurry, because I find it difficult to work out which bits of it are an absolute disaster. And for example, the sort of discourse that has gone on in the last decade about putting forward a convention to protect religions, I have absolutely no time for, good, bad or indifferent. There's about a 2,000-year history that demonstrates very clearly that religions are well able to protect themselves, and most of them have existed for a couple of thousand years. But what we do need to do within our international and national framework is protect freedom of religion and belief, and the right to believe anything or to believe nothing. And that's a very different concept. It's about individual freedom and individual right to practice your religion. religion, as opposed to protecting the religions, which can lead to pretty difficult situations and can also lead to death on the basis of changing your religions. There are limitations to the framework. There are challenges as well. There are particular challenges to the state, and one that I feel we could use a good bit more now is the new public duty, limited and all as it is. How do we ensure that the public duty that comes as part of the equality and human rights legislation actually begins to change the language to the language of duty bearers, you know, to beginning to create a culture of rights. It's not going to go there. But if we didn't have ambition, and I'm reminded, as Susan was talking earlier, about the Commission for Irish Prisoners Overseas. I mean, I remember when we started with Nuala, who did all of the work, the Commission for Irish Prisoners Overseas many, many years ago. And being involved with the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4, and even being involved with Annie Maguire, would lead you to approbation. I remember the first time we tried to get Annie Maguire to speak, we couldn't get anyone to facilitate her. We ended up with local community groups and traveller organisations that we were involved in ourselves. And of course, by the time all of those cases began, by the time a lot of work had been done, and a lot of people in this room, I'd have to say, put their energies and their efforts and the positions they were in behind it, we were able to have that parade of innocence, do you remember, up and down O'Connell Street with the candles, and also the parade of boats and of paper boats around the Liffey. And not only that, but in the end, an outcome became possible. So I think it's really important to acknowledge what can be done from small beginnings. Now, in acknowledging that, I also acknowledge that we didn't change the criminal justice system. We didn't change the fact that a number of people are wrongly convicted and continue to be wrongly convicted in a whole variety of situations. But I do point to it as within a limited framework some of the possibilities. And equally, I point to the public duty as having possibilities. I believe we need to push that framework of human rights in business. No more of this old gobbledygook about corporate social responsibility, which I have absolutely no time for, and I encourage people not to use that language. It's about human rights in business. It's about people's rights to be in trade unions. It's about people's rights to have living wages. And it's about the duty as a duty bearer of businesses to ensure that the way that to do business, whether we've started doing this in CERD actually, so the Dutch nearly went mad when we had a go at Shell about what they were doing in other parts of the world. We've got to get real. If we're going to act locally and think globally, we have to think and act both locally and globally. And then lastly, I think there are challenges for the future to all of us. And I deliberately use the term human rights defenders, you know, because if we're not human rights defenders, we should be human rights defenders. And I think defending human rights begins with the sort of work that we do here to defend what's happening. We also, what happened? Oh, forget it. Well, I'll say it then. I was never... What?
You're being shut down.
I've been told to shut up, I think. Can I just say two things then? This is by way of publicity stunt. We have a seminar in Maynooth on Monday with Francesco Palermo, who's chair of the convention, or who's chair of the advisory committee for the Framework Convention on National Minorities of the Council of Europe, and Patrick Thornbury, who many of you may know, who actually represented the UK on CERD, but really is an Irishman. Actually comes from Galway and has been a champion of minorities globally for many, many years. On this Monday afternoon, if people would like to come, if you'd let us know, you could let myself or Thomas McCann, I can't see anyone else who's here, know maybe, or Marianne O'Shea know afterwards. And we're having another seminar because it's 50 years since CERD was adopted by the United Nations this year on the 18th of May, and we'll get your names maybe from the people who organised the seminar and circulate information about that. But if you just want to put it in your diary, it's the 18th of May and it's the afternoon, and we're hoping to drag here some of the people who are involved in CERD because the meeting in Geneva will just be finishing then. Thank you very much for your attention.